want to remind you all to please mute your microphones so that there's no feedback, unless you have questions and then you can turn your mic on and ask me a question. We will begin. So today is our penultimate meeting for the discussion of the human condition. We are getting close to the end. We're at chapters 41 through 43 in the overarching section on the Vita Activa and the modern age. And as we get to the end, Hannah Arendt is returning back to the beginning and now trying to explain again what the Vita Activa is and why its victory in the modern age is important. And so it's worthwhile, I think, just to remind ourselves, especially as we read these chapters on the reversal of contemplation and action, and then the victory of Homo Faber, what the Vita Activa is and what she's actually talking about. She discussed this back at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, the introduction, part 2, starting on page 11, or 11 or 12, where she talks about the term the Vita Activa. And if you'll recall, the term the Vita Activa, she says, emerges out of the philosophers' worry about the trial of Socrates, namely that Socrates was killed for practicing philosophy. And there was a worry that in the new democratic polis, there would be no place for philosophy. And so Plato and Aristotle set about to justify philosophy. Aristotle specifically offered 3 free lives in opposition to slavery, and they were all concerned with the beautiful. There was the free life of the laborer who was concerned with bodily pleasures. There's the free life of the citizen who's considered with matters of the polis. And there's the free life of the philosopher that is concerned with eternal things. Aristotle uses the word bios politikos, the life of politics, or the activity of politics, specifically the human activity of politics, bios, for the second of these 3 free lives, which is the life concerned with politics or action. But in the medieval age, the translation for bios politikos, Vita Activa, translates with active life, Vita Activa, both bios politikos and also the life of the laborer, and also the life of an artist. All of these 3 are active people and are set against the philosophers who contemplate the truth of the eternal. And up until the modern age, these 3 activities of the Vita Activa, labor, work, and action, are all considered negatively as an unquiet that prevents the true contemplation of either God or the truth or the beautiful. It's only in the modern age that the Vita Activa reverses the hierarchy and elevates itself to the above contemplation. But in these opening sections, what Hannah Arendt writes is that she's not focusing on the Vita Activa because she doubts the distinction between the Vita Activa or the Vita Contemplativa. What she says is that the real reason she's writing about the Vita Activa is that in the reversal of the hierarchy, so that now the life of the active life is higher than the life of contemplation, we have confused these 3 activities of labor, work, and action and blurred them and lost the distinctions that should and once did exist amongst them. In a sense, what she is going to say is that labor, work, and action are all three important parts of the Vita Activa, but that increasingly, not only has contemplation become less important and even irrelevant at times, action has been reduced in value, and eventually work has been reduced in value, and the highest form of the Vita Activa, and thus the highest way of life, is the animal laborans, the laboring animal. And so much of the book is an attempt to articulate the distinctions between these three activities of the Vita Activa: labor, work, and action. That's the first, that's chapters 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 6 on the Vita Activa itself and the modern age is about what she calls both world and earth alienation. And that's what we've spent the last 2 or 3 sessions talking about, the way in which the focus of human life is brought increasingly away from the world and into the mind. And if you'll recall, the event that really defines this for her is the discovery of the telescope by Galileo. And it's also important at this point to recall that what the discovery of the telescope for Galileo means for Arendt is that we come to distrust our senses, right? We think of the rise of the telescope as meaning our senses give us more knowledge, more insight. We know more. But what the telescope and things like it come to do is make us realize that our senses deceive us. We actually can't believe what we see, because if we see the moon, we see it as a white solid blob. We don't see the mountains. And we learn that the truth is always different from what we see, and thus being and appearance, the truth and appearances part company forever. This is one of her central insights. And the philosophical reaction to this is the Cartesian insertion of universal and radical doubt into the modern world, a doubt that is so extraordinary that we cease to believe not only in the truth of appearances, and this is what we talked about our last meeting, but in truth itself. We come to not believe in any kind of worldly or objective truth, and the only place we can seek certainty and truth is in our subjective consciousness, in our minds. And this is the rise of introspection and the loss of common sense that we talked about in sections 39 and 40 last week. I've done that review because it's important in trying to understand now in section 41 what Arendt means by the reversal of contemplation and action. She begins by saying it is a spiritual consequence of the invention of the telescope, right? Why is the inversion or the reversal of contemplation and action a spiritual consequence of the invention of the telescope? Because the telescope brought about what she calls, quoting Whitehead, a rape on our senses. We no longer trust our senses, and thus a loss of faith also in reason, a loss of any sense of self-evidence in the world, and that the only place we can find certainty in myself, so that the world, outside world, the external world, is something that we become alienated from, and truth is only found in an internal mental process. And the true science of truth no longer becomes science that talks about the world, but becomes algebra. Math understood as algebra, based upon a human-made symbolic world that is purely logical and separate from the outside world. What this means for Arendt is that we cannot find any certainty or truth simply by looking at the world, by contemplating the world. And thus, the only way to find certainty or truth in the world is by acting, by doing, by, in a sense, inserting ourselves into the world through the experiment and the scientific experiment. And so the scientific age is the beginning of the age in which action and doing, the Vita Activa, replace contemplation. And contemplation is not only less important than action. She wants to make a stronger claim, because we no longer believe in truth or in appearances. Contemplation actually ceases to be important at all. It becomes irrelevant. And the old practice of contemplating and wondering at the world as a way of inquiring into some truth of the world, for Arendt, fundamentally disappears in the modern age. That's a quick and somewhat dirty, I admit, recap of section 41. Let me stop here and ask if there's questions about chapter 41 or comments on it. These chapters 41 and 42 especially are quite complicated and at times I think a little poorly organized, but are important within her larger argument. So are there questions about chapter 41? You'd have to turn on your mic. I don't. Okay. I think it's worth maybe pick one passage in this chapter to look at. And maybe we'll read the bottom of 291 into 292, where it says the reversal of the modern age consisted then in not raising doing to the rank of contemplating as the highest state in which human beings are capable. So not in raising doing to contemplating, as though henceforth doing was the ultimate meaning for the sake of which contemplation was to be performed. Just as up to that time, all activities of the Vita Activa had been judged and justified to the extent they made the Vita Contemplativa possible. Instead, and this is the really key point, the reversal, therefore the elevation, or the reversal, not elevation, of the Vita Activa concerned only thinking, which from then on was the handmaiden of doing, as it had been the ancilla theologia, the handmaiden of contemplating divine truth in medieval philosophy, and the handmaiden of contemplating the truth of being in ancient philosophy. Contemplation itself became altogether meaningless. And this is really the point. So thinking, which at one point was the beginning of theology, thinking about God, or the beginning of contemplation, thinking about the truth revealed in the world, now all thinking becomes simply a way of a handmaiden of doing, experimenting, acting in the world, making things. And in doing so, that's what contemplation becomes. It becomes a kind of preparation for doing or making. And thus, contemplation itself, in its older signification, becomes absolutely meaningless. So it's almost not that homo faber is raised up so much as contemplation is is abandoned in the modern age. So, questions about chapter 41, or should we go on? I'm happy to take questions. If you have questions, just turn your mic on and you can ask them. Okay. Well, if they come up, feel free to ask again. Chapter 42 is now, after we've talked about the reversal of the Vita Activa and the Vita Contemplativa, so that now active life is higher than contemplative life. The claim here is made that the of the three parts of the active life, namely work, labor, and action, it is work, namely the work of Homo faber, the man that fabricates, that makes things, that works with his hands, that first becomes elevated above both action and labor as the highest of the activities of the Vita Activa. This is partly to be expected, she says, because of the importance of tools in the creation of scientific experiments, right? Some scientific experiments, like dropping, a leaf and a stone off the Tower of Pisa, could have been done any old time, but many more of our experiments now depend upon things like the telescope and spectrometers and tools that are part of the world of Homo faber and of fabrication. We are increasingly in a tool-oriented world, tool-oriented universe. And the makers of tools, it's not surprising that they would become the dominant actors in a world, the modern age, in which Vita Activa replaces the Vita Contemplativa. But what she then says is that it's actually more decisive than that, is that the tool makers and the Homo faber become active in making and fabricating experiments. And here's one of the sort of key ideas of this and the next chapter, which is that the experiment in which we lay out the perimeters, the experiment of our that we are trying to discover. We have an hypothesis. We develop an experiment to test the hypothesis, which either proves or disproves the hypothesis. And what Arendt, is saying here is that as we do so, Homo faber begins to, because we distrust contemplation and we distrust truth and we distrust our senses, we need to remake the natural world. We need to re-solidify it, but we don't re-solidify the natural world because you can't do experiments simply on the natural world. You must do what? Turn the natural world into experimentally satisfying conditions, and thus we make the natural world again in the image of our experiments. And in doing so, we, in a sense, become the maker of our world, which is the rise of Homo faber. There's then a split, and it's a split that I admit she doesn't often describe very clearly, but it's one that we need to at least try and understand. Because on the one hand, what Homo faber makes are things, right? We remember this from the chapter on work. Homo faber makes tools, they make houses, they make artworks is the highest thing that Homo faber makes. What distinguishes what they make is that they last. They are preserved. They're not consumed immediately like labor, and they don't like things of labor, like consumption, and they don't disappear like an action, which happens and then is gone. What they make is things that last, and thus the analogy that if the Homo faber is going to become the highest level, the highest activity, the person of highest activity in our world, higher than contemplation, they need to make our world. And the analogy that becomes current in the 18th century, she says, is the watch and the watchmaker. And just like God was the watchmaker that designed the world of the watch, Homo faber is now designing through experiments and through their work, in a sense, remaking the world through experiments and attempts to make nature again. And then she also describes the rise of the human sciences with Hobbes and others who try and make man again and make politics in the image of man. The split that I mentioned is that there is a fundamental difference between two activities of Homo faber. One, Homo faber, who uses experiments and tools in order to make things, and Homo faber that uses experiments and tools to make things, but the things aren't that important, and what are important is not what is made, but how they are made. Namely, the laws that govern how they are made, or what she here calls processes. And so what she talks about here is a shift from science and making as seeking to create things in the world to a making that seeks not to actually create things, but to understand the processes, the drives, the laws that that underlie how things are made. And there is thus a turn away from Homo faber, by Homo faber, from the world of things to the hidden world of processes. This is the move that will allow Homo faber to be replaced in some way by, as she talks about in the next two chapters, anima laborans, namely as Homo faber, which should be the most worldly of all people and actors in the world because they make things, becomes consumed with processes that are internal and that cannot be seen. Homo faber actually shifts, as she says in chapter 43, from the principle of utility to the principle of happiness. And that what Homo faber seeks is not to actually make useful things in the world, but to make man happy. And in making man happy, man, and I'll just lay it all out here, man can be happy in a vat of nutritional goo hooked up to electrodes, living in a fantasy virtual reality. And that's what she's actually imagining, right? She is talking about the fact that Homo faber is the original highest actor in the world of Vita Activa in the modern age, but partly because of their increasing distrust of the world and of truth and of things and appearance, they turn ever more towards introspection and the experiment and the discovery of laws and processes and divorce themselves from the world. And in doing so, we move from homo faber and the world of utility and things to the world of happiness. That's actually chapter 43. Before we fully get to chapter 43, are there questions about chapter 42? I admit I've done these two chapters a little differently than I usually do in this reading group, because I just find them confusing in the way they're constructed, and in a way you almost have to read them back from chapter 43. But are there questions about these two chapters? I should say that she also, in chapter 42, talks about how in this process that is unleashed by the attempt to make the world and man as an artificial world and man, right? The attempt to the loss, the move away from the sensible and thus the common sense world to a world that we mathematically create through experiments, logic, and math. There is increasingly a divorce between the world of homo faber, the world of his head, and the external world. And what she says is that the effort of philosophy comes to be the effort of reconciliation. And here at the bottom of page 300 into 301, she references Hegel's gigantic enterprise to reconcile spirit with reality, right? To reconcile the spirit, the ideas, the scientific, mathematical, logical truth that is in our head with the reality. And what she says is, in natural science, maybe you can somewhat do that because natural science does follow laws that are discoverable. But in human science, you can't, because human beings and human politics are irrational and are always going to be are always going to foil the attempt to reconcile the world of human affairs with spirit. This is her critique of what we might call economics, certainly of rational choice theory, certainly of anyone who thinks that social science and the social sciences will be able to provide us with rational accounts of human beings that would allow us to make human beings more rational, more efficient, and thus improve the world through a scientific study of the world. All attempts to create theories of human behavior for Arendt, through homo faber, experiment on men, whether it's experimenting on myself like Hobbes does, and looking at my passions and my drives and trying to derive from that a model of man, of rational man that can be calculated, and therefore we can create a government that would be perfect for rational man. Or the social scientists, the sociologists and economists who experiment on people, men and women, and in doing so try and find the social laws that they follow so that we can develop laws and governments that that push people in a rational direction based on our experiments. These kinds of attempts to make man calculable and rational, and through homo faber to create an artificial world of rationality will always founder, as she says, on the rock of reality, namely that humans are not rational. This is on page 300 and 301.
Roger?
Yes.
Harold.
Hi, Harold.
So in my book, on the bottom of 296, she says, in the place of the concept of being, we now find the concept of process. And whereas it is in the nature of being to appear and thus disclose itself, it is in the nature of process to remain invisible, to be something whose existence can only be inferred from the presence of certain phenomena. And then I put that together with the bottom of page 304. She says, the emphasis shifted entirely away from the product and from the permanent, guiding model to the fabrication process, away from the question of what a thing is and what kind of thing was to be produced, to the question of how and through means and processes, which to me underlies the attack on the environment and ecology, because we're not looking at the being, we're just concerned about the process. We're saying we can't really know. I mean, certainly in the current Republican debates, this is shown. You can't know. It's just the process, that being is hidden. To me, that was a really illustrative of the kind of thinking that's gotten us where we are today in lots of realms, but specifically what came up for me was the environment.
Thank you, Harold. I think that's a very acute reading and use or application of her thinking. To the extent processes replace being or appearance, we increasingly don't value the things of this world. We talked earlier, much earlier in the book, about the transfer from property to wealth, how it's one thing to think of a house that is a place of a family's life where you live over generations, which is a kind of property, your eigentum, what you own, to a concept of wealth in which the house is simply an investment. You may live in it, you may rent it out, but it doesn't have lasting meaning. And when you want a new house, you'll tear it down and build a new one, or sell it and buy a new one. And the house becomes not meaningful in itself, except as a matter of wealth. And I think the same could be said of the earth in the example you are using. The earth becomes not something on which we live. It simply becomes it provides the certain necessary chemicals and elements for human life. But if we don't actually need the earth, if we can scientifically create those elements in a vat or in a bubble or in a what is called a heliosphere, or if we can put ourselves into hermetically sealed homes and etc., we can live there as well. You can apply it to the genetic debates. Are we humans with a body, or is the body just some accidental part of our mind, and we can change our bodies, change the way we look, maybe even abandon our bodies in the near future. And what Arendt is saying is that there's a two-stage movement going on here in the reversal of action and contemplation. The first is that Homo faber emerges, who is a maker and makes things. And the second is that since Homo faber increasingly is caught up in things, in processes of making that are that take him away from the world of things that last. So, for example, economy, which we no longer meet in a market to trade things, but we trade our use and labor value. But more importantly, really, is this idea of scientific process, so that the Homo faber is increasingly concerned not with making a watch or making a house, but making something that tells time, whether that's a watch or whether it's a beating pulse in your brain. And thus, there are no lasting values. Exchange value becomes more important than use value, as Hannah Arendt will say in the next chapter. Whether you have this house or that house doesn't matter. They're somewhat interchangeable. And then she invokes Nietzsche on page 307 with the devaluation of all values. What is the devaluation of all values? Well, it's nihilism. What it means is that there's no highest value. There's no value. There's no truth to which contemplation might lead us. There's no truth that describes that we live on this earth that looks the way it does. Just like we can replace one God with another, or even gods with atheism, and just like we can replace the objective world with our subjective varieties of it, we could replace this earth with a different earth. There's no particular reason this earth is now to be thought valuable as opposed to others. The givingness of the world, the idea that some part of humanity is simply finite and takes what's given, is lost, and the turn to processes in which all we know is not what's out there or what's true for others, but is true for ourselves, means that we begin to imagine new subjectively created worlds. And that is, for Arendt, the move from Homo faber and the victory of Homo faber to the principle of happiness, which will then in chapter 44 become the victory of animal laborans. I'm going to spend some time on chapter 43, but before I do, are there any other questions about chapter 42? Anyone want to comment on what Harold said about the environment?
John, but can you hear me?
I hear you, John, but you're sort of, for some reason it's vibrating.
It's vibrating now. Okay, well then I'll turn it off because it's, I don't want to cause that upset. I'll leave my remark for another time. Thank you.
Somebody wrote a question. It's a long one. I'm going to have to look at it. She references Simone Weil, who's a friend of Miłosz. Oppression of man by man grows proportionally to the increase of his realm of action. Facing nature, the member of technical civilization holds the position of a god, but he is a slave of society, the ultimate sanction of any domination. In the previous question about hidden being and the discussion regarding world and self-damnation, doesn't man in his emancipation from nature take on the role of nature? I don't know if man takes on the role of nature, but he certainly comes close to taking on the role of God. I'm not sure if that was the point of the question. I mean, this is a lot of what Hannah Arendt is pushing towards, that man in the devaluation of values comes to see himself as a creator and maker, Homo faber. The difference is that, at least in traditional religious thought, God is good, and God is supposed to make the world for the best of all possible worlds in the Leibnizian formulation, or for a purpose. Whereas it's not at all clear in what way man can make the world for a purpose, or for what purpose, because there are multiple purposes, which is what the devaluation of all values does mean for Nietzsche. In any case, I'm gonna move on, and we can hopefully then we'll have time for some discussion at the end. In chapter 43, Arendt writes at the very beginning, and it's worth reading this first paragraph. Let's go back to the text, which we've been not spending as much time on. If one considers only the events that led into the modern age and reflects solely upon the immediate consequences of Galileo's discovery, which must have struck the great minds of the 17th century with the compelling force of self-evident truth. So note how she keeps going back to Galileo's discovery of the telescope. The reversal of contemplation and fabrication, right? So the idea that fabrication has now overtaken contemplation as the highest activity of free man, or rather the elimination of contemplation, because we no longer even have a place for contemplation in a world without revealed truth, in which senses and the common sense disappear behind the internal world of my internal processes and internal thinking, and thus the elimination of contemplation from the range of meaningful human capacities. It is almost a matter of course. It seems equally plausible that this reversal should have elevated Homo faber, namely the fabricator, which is what she says it did. The question is, why does Homo faber lose his place of esteem and place of freedom and power so quickly? And she begins to answer this on the next page, 306, and the paragraph at the bottom of the page, where she writes, what needs explanation is not the modern esteem of Homo faber, right? That makes sense in a world of tools, in a world of where man is the measure, where man makes things. But what needs to be explained is not the esteem of Homo faber, but the fact that this esteem was so quickly followed by the elevation of laboring to the highest position in the hierarchical order of the Vita Activa. So we have a second reversal. If the first reversal was Homo faber replacing contemplation and even eliminating contemplation, the second now is labor and animal laborans replacing Homo faber. And she says this second reversal of hierarchy within the Vita Activa came about more gradually and less dramatically than either the reversal of contemplation and action in general or the reversal of action and fabrication in particular. Why does it happen? Well, at the very bottom of this page and onto the next page, she writes, what changed the mentality of Homo faber was the central position of the concept of process in modernity. As far as Homo faber was concerned, the modern shift of emphasis from the what to the how, from the thing itself to its fabrication process, was by no means an unmixed blessing. It deprived man as maker and builder of those fixed and permanent standards and measurements which prior to the modern age have always served him as guides for his doing and criteria for his judgment. So as process replaces things, as how replaces what, as Homo faber becomes someone who's concerned not with making watches, but the process of what makes us tick and what makes something tick. Well, when you have a watch, there's a standard. Does the watch tell time? Does it work? Do people like it? Do people use it? Does it last? Or do people discard it? But when you're talking about the processes, what are the standards that determine what is good and what is bad, right? She says it is not only, and perhaps not even primarily, the development of commercial society with the triumphal victory of exchange value over use value. So one thing is the value is no longer measured by how useful it is, but simply whether we can exchange it, whether someone's willing to trade us an island for 16 trinkets, right? So that's one way we divorce ourselves from use value and from the value of standards in the world. And also the principle of interchangeability and relativization and devaluation of all value. No, more than that, for the mentality of modern man, it was determined by the development of modern science and modern philosophy, which is thus the distrust of our senses and thus the doubt of all truth and all senses. It was at least as decisive that man began to consider himself part and parcel of the two superhuman, all-encompassing processes of nature and history. Man sees himself simply as part of an unfolding, right, of nature. So Darwinism, evolutionism. We are not some end, human beings. We're part of a long process of unfolding. And just like the apes were overcome, we will be overcome. There's nothing inherently good or right about human beings or men. And history doesn't lead to some progress in which things get better. It's just an eventual unfolding. It's at that point when the dignity of man, right, that man is a moral, rational being, is lost. Why is the dignity of man lost? Because we're just part of the historical process. And not only are we accidental, not created in the image of God, but evolutionary, we will be left behind at some point. And with the loss of man's dignity, there's the question of what is the meaning of life, right? This is really the way Arendt is thinking about it. Where does one find one's meaning if we are simply part of historical and natural processes? And she's very concerned in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, with one answer that people offer to this question of where we find the meaning of life, which is by attaching ourselves to movements. Whether it's the Nazi movement or the communist movement or the environmental movement, right? To bring up a question from earlier. She worries that what we do as we lose a sense of meaningfulness is we attach ourselves to movements that give ourselves meaning by being part of something that can fight and be victorious. And we find our worth in those movements. And it doesn't really matter which movement we attach ourselves to, because whether you're an environmentalist or a futurist, there's no right answer. There's no highest value. So whether you become a futurist arguing for the singularity, saying we should, in a sense, not care about the earth because we're going to, in a sense, all live in some cloud, or whether you're an environmentalist who says, no, we need to have the earth as our religion and Gaia and the senses and the earthliness, and to be human you must be on Gaia, right? Two very different movements, which, by the way, smart, liberal, conservative, intellectual people today are arguing both sides of, and are two of the most powerful and important movements of our time. It doesn't really matter which one you attach yourself to, because they're both could be right, but neither of them are right. All that matters is that you attach yourself to one, right? Says the people behind these ideas, because what it means to be human is to fight and assert some value, even if it's not a true value. That is, in a sense, the nihilistic thinking of someone like Ernst Jünger, who was a very important German novelist and thinker of the mid-20th century. But it's also, I think, very much the philosophy of American pragmatism and other movements in which we find our meaning simply by fighting for some value. But since there's no true values, it doesn't really matter which one. And it's this process aspect in which the end products don't matter so much as the processual out-development of them that Arendt is here pointing to. And as that the victory of process thinking overcomes the homo faber, his ability to create actual things becomes less and less important. And what becomes dominant for homo faber is not what he creates, but the principle of happiness, the making of himself happy. And thus, happiness, the idea that we are supposed to simply do what makes us happiest, becomes the dominant value of the modern age. We call it utilitarianism today, namely the principle of the maximum amount of happiness with the minimal amount of pain. But Arendt says that's not true utility, because utility is still around things. It's a modern processual utility, which has been divorced from the external world, and is purely integrated into one's internal consciousness. The result of this is that this principle of happiness for her is going to lead towards the only value that we now share, which is that the only value we can agree on, which is what we might call the lowest common denominator of happiness, which is life, right? Which is the promotion of individual life, which is why for her, human rights has become largely about the protection of life, because it's the only principle of happiness that we today are able to sort of agree on. The problem is life doesn't distinguish us from ants or dogs or amoeba or plants, and simply keeping people alive does not keep them human for her. Humanity means more than simply living. And this is the beginning of the another reversal, which is that as life becomes the highest good, as the ultimate principle of happiness, we return back to labor, and labor will replace work, and animal laborans will replace homo faber as the highest activity of the modern age. So that's what we're going to get to in chapters 43 and 44 as we end the book next month. Why don't I stop there and leave us a little time for discussion if there's questions or comments or thoughts. I realize this is a little more abstract than some of her other chapters. I mean, this is where she's really moving towards her final big claim, which is that the human condition has lost contemplation, but more importantly, in the Vita Activa, simply the activity of life and staying alive has become the dominant activity. and within the Vita Activa, both work, the creation of lasting and meaningful things, and action, the experience of plurality, freedom, and difference, have been sacrificed to simply the expert-driven bureaucratic processes of keeping people alive, which is the danger that this book is written to make us aware of. Questions? John wrote a question. I see a certain ironic connection between the ancient search for truth via contemplation and our modern ideas about scientific truth. Both Plato and Aristotle saw ereton, the good, as being beyond speech, beyond words. On the other hand, scientific truths are mostly expressible in mathematical symbols, equally nonverbal, and furthermore, a fabrication of man. So that's true in the sense that Plato and Aristotle saw the truths of contemplation to be unexpressible in words, but nevertheless for them to be comprehensible to a thinker, to someone who contemplated the world. They were unexpressible to the common people or in common language, but could be revealed. That's one difference. Whereas the scientific truths are not, in the end, can't be revealed. But the reason the Platonic and Greek truths could be revealed and the scientific truths can't, and this is the second and I guess more important difference, is that the Platonic truths were common. They were in the world. They were true for everyone. By everyone, we don't mean universally like a scientific truth, but we mean, for example, for all Greeks. There was a Greek truth, and there was maybe a Persian truth. But there were truths that were in the world that people trusted to be a part of their common world. Whereas scientific truths, by their universality, are not even true only in this universe, but everywhere. And they therefore can never be physically in a place located. And that is the difference between, that's one major difference between scientific and contemplative truth. Other questions? Got a couple minutes. Can't hurt to just make a comment.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, John Ennis here.
Hi, John.
So I sent you the question earlier about man replacing nature, and I guess the thrust of my thinking was when Arendt begins taking us on this journey of kind of like man's developmental history in society and politically and all of it, nature's an oppressive force. And through effort and all the various manifestations she describes, we somehow come to master a good deal of nature, and we've arrived at the moon and are going beyond it. And in doing so, we've kind of lost ourselves to the process. And as nature was hidden in the beginning, our being is now the hidden thing. And so I guess our discoveries and our advancement kind of like nature throw us back upon ourselves. And I'm wondering if I thought I had read as I finished the book up that there's another reversal where contemplation becomes again more valuable than Vita Activa. Did I misread that? So that what happens is being thrust back on ourselves, we're forced back to contemplate and look for revealed truths about not nature, external nature, but our own internal natures and what really is life-sustaining and of value to human beings. I don't know if that's accurate or it makes sense, but to me it does. Cookie.
So, to some degree, yes. I mean, Hannah Arendt is not going to. What the quote at the end of the book is not per se about contemplation. It's about thinking, and it's never is he more active than when he does nothing. Never is he less alone than when he is by himself. And the gloss in it that she gives is thought, right? Is what she's here talking about, is still possible, although ever more rare. And she says, for if no other test but the experience of being active, no other measure but the extent of sheer activity were to be applied to the various activities within the Vita Activa, it might well be that thinking as such would surpass them all. Which means that thinking here is understood not as contemplation, but as the Vita Activa, as part of the Vita Activa for Arendt. Thinking not as a pure contemplation of being, but thinking as the activity of thought. And that activity of thought is for her what part of the Vita Activa, and yet not reducible to animal laborans or labor. It is for her really almost not active in laboring, whereas it is active in both working and in acting. You can't act without thinking, because in order to act, you have to not behave, right? You have to act not as a behaving individual, but surprisingly and different, which means you must separate yourself from the mass. That means you have to think. You can't be an artist and create a work that is surprising and new and worthy of being preserved unless you separate yourself from a mass and create something new, which happens in thought. And so the book ends with a discussion of thinking, which is not one of the three activities of the Vita Activa that she says is accessible and is done by everyone, right? Like labor, work, and action, but which she says is becoming ever more rare. It was always rare, but it's because it was only people who acted and people who did work who were the thinkers. But as we are becoming all more laborers and not even actors or workers, even thinking is becoming rarer than it already was. And let's hope it doesn't disappear completely. And she doesn't think it will, but she thinks it will become ever more circumscribed for those who think, and thus those who can work and act. And the book is about this happening, which, if we understand the teaching of the book, which is that if you think and act and think and create works, you can insert new processes into the world. Then you can change the world and change what's happening. And that is the hopeful ending of the book. Someone, I think, is sharing their screen, just so you know. I don't know who it is. In any case, our time is up, and I thank you all. We will finish the book in December, and I look forward to. We'll try and leave some time in December for those who want to have a little bit of an extra conversation. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.